welcome to our webinar on the science behind the abortion debate, hosted by Feminists, Choosing Life of New York, featuring Monica Snyder with Secular Pro-Life. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. My name is Michelle Sterlace, Executive Director of Feminists, Choosing Life of New York, here with Emily Capello, FCLNY's Media Outreach Coordinator. We will be interviewing Monica for about 45 minutes, leading a discussion with a series of questions regarding abortion and pregnancy and how they intersect with science, scientific data, and studies. And the webinar will cover three main topics: the science of human life, the science of pregnancy, and the science of abortion. After the interview, we will engage in audience Q&A for about 15-20 minutes. Please submit your questions for Monica anytime throughout the interview in the Q&A box on your screen. Emily and I will ask Monica as many of your questions as time allows. So, Monica Snyder is an atheist and the executive director of Secular Pro-Life, a group dedicated to advocating secular arguments against abortion and creating space for atheist, agnostic, humanist, and other non-religious people to do anti-abortion work. Monica has a bachelor's degree in chemical biology and a master's degree in forensic science, and takes a particular interest in the intersection between science and the abortion debate. So hi, Monica, how are you?
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yes, thank you for your time today and your willingness, Monica, to share your knowledge, expertise, and insights on the science behind the abortion debate. And it's a debate that continues fiercely, even more so, I believe, since the U.S. Supreme Court overturned Roe versus Wade.
Absolutely.
So to begin, here we go, the science of human life. So what does science say about when life begins? And is there scientific consensus regarding the point in time when human beings begin their existence?
So in terms of biology, the first stage of the individual human life cycle, the first stage of the individual human organism's life cycle is the zygote. So you hear all the time pro-lifers say life begins at conception. I understand how that phrase can seem sort of vague to people. When you say life begins at conception, they don't know if you mean a biological human organism, their existence begins at conception, or if you mean a morally valuable human person begins at conception. And so I want to take a moment to make a distinction here. We are right now talking strictly about biology. Personhood is a philosophical topic, and sometimes they'll tell us that the individual human organism's life cycle begins with the zygote. And so as far as consensus on that issue, I want to be very careful when I answer that question. If you are asking biologists when a mammalian organism's life cycle begins, or when specifically the human organism life cycle begins, yes, there is consensus on it. It begins with the zygote. That is the first stage. But if you're asking them when you have a morally valuable person, they're going to give more variable answers, because that is more of a philosophical and sometimes political. It's a different topic. So in, I think, 2018, out of the University of Chicago, Steve Jacobs did a dissertation on this, where he surveyed biologists all around the world. And he surveyed, I think, 5,500 biologists from over 1,000 academic institutions. 95% of them had PhDs. I think over 80% of them were pro-choice. Over 60% of them were secular. And he asked them to categorize as correct or incorrect certain statements. And the statements were things of the, I'm not gonna get the quote verbatim exactly right, but it was on the lines of, the beginning of a mammalian organism's life cycle is the zygote, because that's when you have a distinct entity with DNA, so on and so forth. And the vast majority of all of them said, yes, that's correct. Now, when we talk about that result, and pro-lifers talk about this, they'll talk about how biologists will acknowledge, a vast majority of biologists will acknowledge that life begins at conception. What they mean is that they said, yes, an organism begins with the zygote. The zygote is a new, different organism from the parents, and so on. It doesn't mean those biologists are pro-life. It doesn't mean that they think that that zygote is a morally valuable person. Some of them do, some of them don't. But again, I'm just trying to be really clear that in terms of biology, yes, we do know when life begins, when an individual human organism's life begins. Now, sometimes when I talk about this, people will say, well, human life began millions of years ago and it goes in cycles. Yeah, I get what you're saying, but I'm talking about an individual human organism. You did not begin millions of years ago. I did not begin millions of years ago. In terms of our individual biological identity, we began when our parents had sex and conceived a new human offspring. This is not controversial at all. Outside of the abortion debate, when science communicators are talking about when life begins, they will readily acknowledge that we all began as a single cell, a very particular single cell, the zygote. It's not the same thing as like your skin cells or whatever, because it is on a path of self-directed growth and development as an organism. But we do begin as a single cell, the zygote. Yes.
Is there any particular point in time during prenatal human life, and this sort of leads into the second question, but where that unborn child becomes more of a biological human, or does that biological humanity begin at fertilization?
No, the organism, a human organism, begins with the zygote and then it develops from there through adulthood into death. No, so it doesn't become more of a whole organism later. It does have important developmental milestones, of course, as we all do.
Right.
And those are what people usually debate when they're talking about personhood.
Okay.
When people debate personhood, they're saying, well, being a human organism isn't enough. You have to be a human organism that can live on your own, independent of a woman's body, or that is born, or that has a heartbeat, or they'll pick different markers in developmental milestones for what they view as personhood, but they're making philosophical claims. They're saying, per their worldview, per their ethical premises, you don't have something of value enough to merit protection or enough to have this argument until XYZ. But in terms of biology, it's a human organism the whole time. It doesn't become a human organism, for example, with a heartbeat.
Right. So what you're saying too, Monica, is that there is, these are separate concepts, personhood and the biology of human life.
Yes. And that's something that I think both sides of the debate could do better to delineate. It's not just pro-choice people who are equivocating. Pro-lifers will often say, life begins at conception, so we should outlaw abortion. And I'm not saying I disagree with either one of those statements. It's just that there are multiple steps between the first and the second to get from the premise to the conclusion. You have to talk about philosophy. You have to talk about why we value humans, what we value in humans that makes us worth protecting and defending. You have to talk about that.
Exactly. And so it's interesting because we know that the legislature, legislative bodies bestow personhood, right? They're the ones that are elected officials, or even unelected Supreme Court justices determine really which humans are persons in which humans are not considered persons under the law and therefore worthy of all those legal protections. But but you can't legislate who is a biological human and who is not. Right?
No.
Okay.
Or I hope not, because it's a pretty definitive thing.
Exactly.
Yeah, and so when we talk about how, well, there'll be arguments, the law doesn't recognize an embryo as a person. Yeah, not in some ways. In some ways, yes. In some ways, no. It depends on who you're talking about. What, like there are situations where the law does recognize embryos as interested parties, right? And there's also situations where the law recognizes non-humans as persons. We talked about like corporate personhood, that kind of thing. So the law is important. It really affects how we function as a society, but it doesn't actually determine biological reality. And I would argue it doesn't really determine ethics either. We as a society talk about what ethical principles we want to see the law reflect. The law doesn't tell us what to do. We decide what the laws will be. So there's plenty of historical examples of the law not reflecting the value and the deserving of protection of many different groups of people. We already know that. And so we should already know from the get-go, whatever we decide about the abortion debate, the law doesn't dictate morality. The law reflects our moral principles.
Excellent. Now I'm going to ask another question related to the science of human life, because this is about the science behind the abortion debate. But I just want to throw out there a question I'd love to tackle at another webinar. And it's this: do you think unborn children, right, regardless of gestational age, should be considered legal persons under the law? Again, another question for another webinar, but it just shows how, confused the issues are, and mixed in within the body politic, folks, understanding that the difference between legal personhood status and human biology, and when does in fact human life begin.
It's very multifaceted.
Exactly. Thank you. All right, so can you describe the vital stages and occurrences of prenatal development?
So depending on who you're talking to, they might feel different milestones are important for different reasons. But within the abortion debate, the topics that get brought up a lot are embryonic hearts, or lack thereof, allegedly, and viability. And so regarding embryonic hearts, obviously this is a big deal, because I think around 2019 is when it really started to pick up, where our side started to have anti-abortion laws based on heartbeat. And so all of a sudden the embryonic heart became a huge focus of the discussion. People had been talking about it before then, but especially once that happened. And I was surprised. I remember this vividly. Once we started proposing heartbeat laws, the response from the abortion rights side, it wasn't, well, heartbeat's not important philosophically. Just because something has a heart doesn't mean it's a person. That was not the response. I mean, people do say that, but the primary response of the abortion rights side was, there is no heart and there's not a heartbeat. And at the time when this first started happening, I was astounded at the audacity to make that claim. It's so egregiously false. It's so clearly egregiously false. Now, you don't have to care about the heart. You don't have to think that it is important philosophically or politically or legally. I get that. But to say it doesn't exist it's false. It's factually incorrect and easily verifiable. So if people want to check the sources I'm about to summarize, you can always go to our website, secularprolife.org/hearts. And it's literally just a list of sources that you click on them. They go out of our website to all of these scientific sources. They're not pro-life sources. They're anatomy textbooks. They're research into embryogenesis, that kind of thing. But you will not find an embryology textbook or a biology textbook to contradict it, because the reality is that between 6 and 7 weeks gestation, which is between 4 and 5 weeks after fertilization, between 6 and 7 weeks gestation, the embryo has a chambered heart using coordinated muscle contractions to unidirectionally pump blood through veins to exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide, to exchange nutrients. It is already doing that. Everything I just said, we've known that for a long time. When they first started saying embryos don't have hearts, I tried to clarify, what do you mean? How could you possibly be defining heart to say the embryo does not have it? Because they do have a small chambered organ using coordinated muscle contractions to pump blood through veins for oxygen exchange. They definitely have that. So when you say they don't have a heart, what are you defining heart as, if not that? And at first I couldn't get a clear answer. And eventually they came to, and you will see this now too, they would say, well, it's not a heartbeat, because when you hear a heartbeat in like an adult, like if you have a stethoscope, you hear a heartbeat, you're hearing valves opening and shutting as they pump blood. That's what you're hearing. And between 6 and 7 weeks, the valves aren't fully formed yet. This is the bedrock on which they say there's no heart or heartbeat, is that it's not a fully developed adult heart, which is so transparently absurd. There are so many species that we will say, oh, they have a heart, this is their cardiovascular system, and it's not identical to the adult human heart. And you don't say, well, it's not a heart. Only in the abortion debate, all of a sudden, does it have to be identical to the adult human heart to be a heart. I'm not saying embryos have adult hearts. I'm saying embryos have embryonic hearts. And by hearts, I mean organs designed to pump blood through your body to exchange gases. That's what hearts are. And this has nothing to do with how I feel about abortion personally or the ethics of abortion. It is just a fact that they have that. And so then they'll say another thing that they talk about that they get completely wrong is they'll say, well, ultrasounds, not only do they have to convince the general public, but they have to convince millions of parents who have gone to their prenatal ultrasound appointment and listened to the heartbeat or watched a visualization of the heartbeat and had their medical professional tell them, this is your child's heart rate. They'll measure the heart rate, the embryonic or fetal heart rate. Millions of parents have personally experienced that. And now you're telling them all that was not true. It wasn't a heart. It wasn't a heartbeat. The medical profession is just lying and dumbing things down to you because it's too complicated to explain that it's not a heart. It's the biggest gaslighting. It's ridiculous. And so they'll say, well, yes, they went and they got the ultrasound and they thought they heard a heartbeat, but really the ultrasound is just detecting electrical activity. A couple points there. There is electrical activity because we use electrical activity for our hearts to pump. Your heart is doing that right now also. That is true. It's very much like the clump of cells things. Yes, an embryo is a bunch of cells. So are you. What you're saying is not technically untrue. It's just useless. Okay. So there is electrical activity. Ultrasounds don't detect electrical activity. They literally can't detect electrical activity. Ultrasounds detect movement. And in this case, when you go to your first prenatal appointment and you get the ultrasound, they're detecting the movement, the rhythmic contraction of the heart as it pumps blood. That's the movement they're detecting. And then it's true that they take that information and they convert it into an audio signal that we can detect. That is true. And so they're right that the ultrasound is creating an audio signal for us, but they're wrong to suggest, first of all, that it's based on electrical activity versus movement, which might not matter to you, depending on how you feel about it. But second, to suggest that they're trying to suggest the ultrasound is making up the heartbeat. The heart is pumping blood. We detect sound through pressure waves that enter our ears and affect the inner workings of our ear, right? And embryonic hearts are so small that when they are contracting and pumping blood, they are creating little pressure waves too small for our ears to detect. So we've developed technology to give us that detection for us. It doesn't mean the heart doesn't have pressure waves it's giving off. It doesn't mean that there's no heartbeat. There is. It's sort of like the analogy I've been trying to use more often now is right now, as you're talking to me, you aren't actually hearing my voice. I am in a different state. There's no way you could hear my voice from where I'm sitting to where you're sitting. But if I went to you, if you said, oh, I was talking to Monica and her voice sounded excited or her voice sounded like she had a cough, and someone said, that wasn't her voice. That was Zoom software converting signals it got to you to make you think it was her voice. And you're like, wow, great point.
Yeah, that makes it that's an excellent analogy.
That's basically what they're saying when they say, first of all, they say it detects electrical activity, which it does not. And second of all, even if they were right about that, the point they're making is useless because it's detecting the heart pumping blood.
Okay, Monica, for the sake of time, beyond, let's just go to maybe one or two other stages of prenatal, thinking of maybe pain, brain waves, those kinds of things as well.
So the one I did want to touch on is viability. This is important because a lot of abortion laws have been based on the concept of viability. So viability is the idea that if the fetus is born at X time, it would have at least a 50-50 chance of surviving. And so, for example, when Roe v. Wade was decided, viability was thought to be between 24 and 28 weeks. As our technology improves, it gets a little earlier. Now there's this group called 22 Weeks Matters. It's founded by parents whose children were born at 22 weeks and went through very harrowing experiences because a lot of hospitals will either be unable to or choose not to do life-saving interventions that early because that's really on the very early edge of viability. And so they think that it will be a waste of resources. And this group, 22 Weeks Matters, is founded to start making people aware that it's not. There was a paper, I can send you the sources on this later if you want, but there was a paper done that was looking at the survival and the survival without impairment of very premature infants based on whether the hospital did life-saving measures or not. And they found a pretty big difference in the overall average over all hospitals. If a child was born at 22 weeks, only 5% of them survived. But in the hospitals that gave life-saving interventions, it was 23%. The point being that, yes, it's very early and still most of them will not make it. But the idea that there's no point in trying is incorrect because it can make this multifold difference. The reason I bring it up is because viability is, in a sense, it is a biological development. The more developed the fetus gets, the more likely he or she could survive. But it's also a technological development. And so when people talk about how, we get back to personhood, when people talk about how I don't really think they're a person until they can survive outside the womb, that's an interesting way to put it because they can survive outside the womb more in places with advanced technology and less in others. Someday in the future, we might have the technology for artificial wombs where they could survive outside the womb from conception on, or from 5 weeks on, and then they'd be viable. Does that mean 50 years in the future, a 5-week embryo is a person, whereas right now a 5-week embryo is not? Maybe you think it does. It's a little confusing to think that whether or not you are a person deserving of protection will depend primarily on the technology of where you live. That seems counterintuitive. So that was the other milestone I wanted to mention, and how it's kind of a moving target.
Yeah, it's excellent. Excellent.
Thank
Monica, if you can just quickly touch on, at what point does the unborn child experience pain?
So this is very controversial. A lot of major medical organizations will claim that that doesn't happen until there are certain connections into the cerebral cortex, which happens either getting into like the 3rd trimester, or some will claim they can't experience it at any point during pregnancy at all because of the environment of the womb. But there are other researchers that have been starting to come out with different arguments. An important paper to check out, it's called Reconsidering Fetal Pain by John Bachman and Stuart Derbyshire. It was in the Journal of Medical Ethics. I think at this point it is either that, this is a very prestigious journal that's been around forever, and it's their 2nd or 3rd most read paper they've ever published. And Stuart Derbyshire in particular, he is a major pain researcher. He helped contribute to an overview of fetal pain in like 2010 in the UK. And that reason that's important is because he co-authored this paper with John Bachman, where he said, I might have been mistaken. And he basically said, and he's pro-choice, John Bachman is pro-life. They emphasize in the paper that this isn't about ethics of abortion. This is just about what does the science say. It's a very good paper. You should definitely check it out. But they essentially say that there is different research to show that maybe the way we're defining this, the way we're conceptualizing this is incorrect. And there was another paper that came out more recently. I think it was called Fetal Pain in the First Trimester by Dr. Bridget Thill, Thill. And it was much more technical. I think it's open access. You can check it out. It's a little bit more difficult to follow. But one of the things she had in it that I thought was very impactful is she talked about how historically the medical community did not think that newborn infants could feel pain because they didn't think that their brains were developed enough. And all the way up into the mid to late 1980s, it was standard to do things like open heart surgery or other major invasive surgeries with paralytics, but without pain medications. It was standard that they did this. And a child, I'm sure not just one child, but one particular infant died after open heart surgery with no pain meds. And when his mother found out that they didn't give him pain meds, she basically went on the warpath. And she started this whole movement to advocate for more humane treatment of newborns. And then importantly, there was another study that came out, unfortunately right now, the name is escaping me, in the 1980s, where this guy basically said, maybe we should check this out. And he took, it was not a large number, it was like 8 infants in one group and 8 in another that were going to get major surgery. And for 8 of them, he gave them pain meds and measured their recovery compared to the 8 that he gave no pain meds to, which was at the time standard. And the children that had pain meds recovered much better, and their physiological reactions were such that it was strong evidence that whatever you think about their brain development, they can in fact feel pain. Now we look back on that with horror. We're like, I can't imagine that you're basically making a surgery center into a torture chamber because you're not giving babies pain meds, because the medical profession at that time, the conventional wisdom was that they can't feel pain. Now, obviously, a newborn baby is at a different developmental level than a fetus. I'm not saying it's the same. I'm just saying a little humility is warranted because it is a debate, and to brush it off completely and say, oh, no, they don't have the brain development, I'm sure it's fine. I hope you're right. I hope you're right.
Monica, there's a movie from a while back called The Silent Scream by Bernard Nathanson.
Right.
I don't remember how old that unborn child was that was filmed during an abortion, and how that unborn child just moved away from the instrument that was aborting. So, all right, before we move on to the second question that Emily is going to present, you know, we can walk away just really understanding that there's absolute scientific consensus that human beings begin their existence at conception, right?
Yes, and biologically speaking, a human organism begins with a zygote. This is not and should not be controversial.
And that unborn child doesn't become any more human as that unborn baby advances throughout the pregnancy.
No, there's a human organism from beginning to end. The debate should strictly be about the philosophy of personhood and not about biology.
Yeah, we've moved now on to that in 2023, and that's quite intense. All right, Monica, thank you. I'm going to hand it over to Emily. Emily, I'm interested.
Thank you, Monica, for that wonderful description of the science of human life. Our second topic, we're going to move on to the science of pregnancy. Will you please explain the science of pregnancy and the impacts that pregnancy has on women?
Well, that's a huge question. So I will say on a personal note, as someone who has been pregnant multiple times, that the impact of pregnancy on women is very significant. And I think it's very important. I am pro-life. I'm against abortion. Okay. I say that to contextualize. When people who are against abortion talk about this, I think it is important not to minimize the effects of pregnancy. And a lot of times in the debate, we will talk about more dangerous complications, risks of pregnancy, and that is important. But I'm saying even for just a normal, healthy pregnancy with no major complications, it still affects every single body system a woman has. If it wasn't the normal process of reproduction, if you just saw someone on the street, you never heard of pregnancy, it didn't even exist, and they described to you the symptoms that women go through in a normal pregnancy, you'd be like, oh my gosh, are you okay? Because it impacts everything. It impacts your skin and your hair and your nails and your digestion and your just everything. And so the first thing I wanted to say is that it would be helpful if pro-life people and people advocating against abortion, please do so without minimizing that pregnancy is significant. That said, the other side, I think, does like to really be hyperbolic about how dangerous pregnancy typically is. It is serious. You should have a medical team. You should make sure you are keeping track of your symptoms. You should be safe. But people will talk about abortion as self-defense. And sometimes when they say that, what they mean is that pregnancy could kill you. And so being forced to stay pregnant could kill you. And so abortion is self-defense. That's not how we conceptualize self-defense in any other context. Self-defense is not lethal action against someone for any non-zero chance that you might be harmed. Self-defense is supposed to be in response to significant danger. And so when we talk about the science of pregnancy, it's significant. Even for a normal healthy pregnancy, it's significant and it affects you a lot. It is not typically life-threatening, and that's important to keep in mind too. Another thing I wanted to touch on, because I'm seeing this more and more, I've seen it the whole time I've been in the abortion debate, but I feel like I'm seeing a rise now, is the idea of whether or not embryos are parasites. They're not. And to be frank, the whole concept I shouldn't say it's ridiculous. There are some parallels. You know, embryos use nutrients and resources from the woman's body, and embryos have biological mechanisms to signal to the woman's body, hey, don't destroy me, even though I am not the same cells as you. So, you know, your immune system is designed to tell the difference between cells that are supposed to be in your body and cells that are not. That's your immune system's job. And the embryo or fetus is a different human being than you are, has different DNA than you do. And so there has to be, in terms of evolution, there has to be a mechanism for the embryo or fetus to be able to signal to the woman's body, don't destroy me, this is actually like supposed to be happening, right? And so people will compare that to parasites, where they take nutrients and they will say they're tricking the woman's body into not destroying them. I think tricking is a pretty ridiculous word, because it's literally how we reproduce. But they'll ignore all of the ways in which embryos are nothing like parasites. And so the first example is how our bodies are trying to make pregnancy happen. It doesn't mean that we want pregnancy to happen. It doesn't mean you have to get pregnant or have kids. I'm not saying any of that, but we go through cycles every month, you know, the thickening of the uterine lining, all that stuff, to prepare in case there is an embryo for us to develop, right? The oocyte, the egg cell that the woman releases, it has what's called a ZP3 glycoprotein on it, which is a sperm binding receptor. It's designed to try to get sperm to connect. And once a sperm does connect, it has a process where it gives off waves of calcium ions that basically make it so other sperms can't connect. You want only one. If you have more than one sperm enter the egg, that's called polyspermia. It usually means that it's not viable. And so it's nothing like parasites, because our body is building it ourselves. It's not like tapeworms that you accidentally ingested their eggs, or a mosquito injects malaria into you or something. Our body is building the embryo. And the other thing I wanted to point out, I've been reading about this more recently. Another way it's not like parasites, parasitic relationships are defined by taking, and harming the host. And leaving aside how that doesn't make any sense in terms of evolution, because if we defeated these parasites, our species would cease to exist. So it doesn't make any sense from the beginning. But also there's this thing called fetal-maternal microchimerism, or it also goes the other way too, maternal-fetal microchimerism. And those are just scientific ways of saying that fetal cells enter the mother's body and maternal cells enter the fetus's body and stay. And it's kind of a newer area of research. Some people think because for so long medical research basically focused on male bodies, like even though pregnancy is so fascinating and strange and complicated, I guess we just didn't care to figure it out for a long time because those were women's bodies, so who cares? But anyway, now it's more of a growing body of research, often conducted by women, looking into how they're finding fetal cells in basically every organ of a mother's body, even up to decades after she has given birth. And they don't know exactly what those cells are doing. For a long time, they thought that they might be causing like immune reactions, like when an organ recipient finally gets a donation and then the body rejects it. They thought it might be like that because they were seeing larger amounts of these cells when there were certain diseases and problems. But now they're increasingly thinking that they see more of them in those cases because the fetal cells in the mother's body are helping her repair tissue damage and other problems that she's having. So they had at least one study with humans where they found a higher amount of fetal cells in the scars after C-sections. And they thought maybe it was because they were helping repair tissue damage from C-sections. In not in a human study, but in a mouse study, they found that fetal mouse cells helped build new blood vessels for damaged hearts in the mom mice. And so the fetal cells appear to be progenitor cells, which is a kind of cell that can differentiate into different types. Like you could have they could be like white blood cells, red blood cells, platelets, or you could have like lymphoid progenitor cells, which could be different immune system cells, whatever. The point is that they think maybe what's happening is these fetal cells go into the mom's body and help repair problems. And it makes sense from an evolutionary perspective because the fetus does better if the mom does better. And then there's a reverse of that too, where maternal cells go into the fetus's body. This is a little less surprising because there's been research for a long time showing that maternal antibodies can go to the fetus. They can go through breast milk and other things. Basically, in the first few months of the fetus's life, mom's antibodies are helping protect that like new immune system as it's developing. They've known that for a while, which is pretty cool. But they think that there are also other maternal cells going into the fetus's body that might be helping in similar ways. It's still pretty new research. It's really interesting. But my bigger point is that parasites don't operate like that. It doesn't make any sense to think of the embryo as a parasite because embryos are our species and they are us reproducing. And it makes sense from an evolutionary standpoint that the mom and child would try to keep each other alive and healthy. So
thank you, Monica. Yeah. And moving on to the second part of this about the science of pregnancy, there are these turnaway studies that are often cited. They're known for their findings about women who receive abortions. But what did it find about women who carried their pregnancies?
Yes, this is super important. So the Turnaway study, if you don't already know, it's a study about women who went to get abortions. They physically showed up at clinics to get abortions. Some of them got abortions, some of them were turned away, hence the name of the study. Usually turned away because they were past the gestational limit for the clinic. And the Turnaway study is famous for talking about how 5 years later, women who aborted did not regret it. And also talking about how women who couldn't get abortions had worse financial outcomes. I remember when the finding about women not regretting came out, it was covered extensively. And at the time, I remember thinking, well, if they asked the women who aborted what their emotions were 5 years out, did they ask the other group? But there was no information on that. So I assume they just didn't ask them. And then a couple of years later, they actually did publish a finding where they asked the women who couldn't get abortions how they felt about it. And it turned out that 5 years after being denied an abortion, 96% of women said they no longer wish they'd gotten one. And you never hear anyone talk about this with the Turnaway study. And it's important because it's important for a bunch of reasons. It's important for pro-lifers to understand because I see some subset of pro-lifers talk as if any woman who considers an abortion or tries to get an abortion will be a terrible mother and her children should be taken away from her, which to be frank, it's just, you just don't understand what's going on. Clearly, even women who go to clinics to get abortions, it doesn't mean they won't love their children. It doesn't mean that they won't want their children. They're reacting to other factors besides just how they will feel about a newborn baby. It's also important to understand, because I think the abortion rights side talks about abortion denial as if it will basically ruin women's lives. Now, here's what is true. Abortion denial can make things a lot more difficult for people, because having children is harder than not having children in a lot of ways. And so the Turnaway study found that there were worse economic outcomes for women who were denied abortion versus women who got abortions. But what they don't tell you is almost all of the outcomes that they measured resolved within a couple of years. I'm not saying that's unimportant. Even temporary poverty is important, speaking as someone who's been very low income before. But it is also important to understand that it's not the rest of your life and it's not permanent. And so the Turnaway study found like household income, full-time employment rate, percent below the poverty line, all of those things. By the time of the end of the study period, those things were all the same between the women who aborted and the women who couldn't get abortions. And for people who have children, this should not be surprising at all, because the study period was 5 years. 5 years after a pregnancy, your child is getting to like preschool age or like going to school age, and things are starting to go into a new phase that's a little bit less hectic. So when we talk about the Turnaway study and everyone focuses on what it found about how abortion affects women, they never talk about the findings of how carrying the pregnancy. Oh, another important thing to know about what they found about carrying the pregnancy. I'll say, 96% of women said they no longer wish they'd aborted 5 years later. And people say, well, yeah, of course they're saying that now because they have like a 4.5-year-old child sitting right in front of them that they love. Of course they're going to say that, which first of all, yeah, of course they are. But secondly, they're trying to imply that their emotions were swayed once they were holding that born baby in their arms and they bonded to them. And I'm sure that that is a thing that happens. But the Turnaway study found that most of the change in emotions happened before the child was born. So 1 week after being denied an abortion, already over a third of the women said they no longer wish they'd aborted 1 week later. Okay. And by the time of the child's birth, it was 88%. So the child hasn't even been born yet. And 88% of the women who physically showed up to clinics to get abortions already are saying they don't wish they'd gotten an abortion. And it did increase more after that. By the time of the child's first birthday, it was 93%, and 5 years out, it was 96%. So it increased more after that, but most of the change happened before the child was even born. Now, you could argue, once options are taken away from you, you resolve yourself to your fate. And I'm sure there's some element of that. But you could also argue that maybe not all of these women really wanted to get an abortion. I think there's a good argument for saying that at least some subset of them, they felt they ought to, they felt they had to, but it doesn't mean that they wanted to. And for some of them, when they couldn't, when it just wasn't an option anymore, they were kind of fine with that because they hadn't really wanted to. And I think that's a very important thing. It's definitely something that would be worth further exploration and study, and something that society does not talk about enough.
Exactly. Wow. All right. Thank you, Monica. I'm going to transition here to the third and final topic before we open up to Q&A. I wish we could have a longer webinar, right? But an hour.
That happens every time.
It's intense, right? So our third topic covers science of abortion. If you can give us some scientific descriptions, right, of the different abortion procedures, surgical, want to talk also about medication abortion,
yes,
and gestational age of the unborn child in terms of the abortion technique and procedures.
Yes. So I'll try to be more succinct, but so in the first trimester, you can get either what used to be called a surgical abortion, and now they're saying call it procedure. It doesn't matter. You can get a procedure in clinic, or you can get the abortion pills. If you get the procedure in clinic, it's a DNC, which means dilation and I might not be saying this word correctly, cutterage. It's basically where they dilate the cervix and they use a surgical tool to scrape the uterine lining and get all of the embryo and all other tissue out. That's the surgical procedure. Right. And then the abortion pills, which we can talk about more later, but the abortion pills are basically 2 pills, mifepristone and misoprostol. The first one is to block progesterone. It breaks down the uterine lining. It disconnects the embryo from the uterine lining, cannot access oxygen or nutrients or anything. And then misoprostol initiates contractions to expel the embryo from the body. So in the first trimester, those are the 2 ways that people can get abortions. As you go into the second trimester, Currently in the United States, abortion pills are only approved up to, I think, 10 weeks. Although there are other places in the world where they use them further than that. But in the United States, when you go into the second trimester, it's going to be a surgical procedure, and they'll switch from D&C to D&E.
How old is the child, Monica? At the
after first trimester, we're now talking 13 weeks.
13
So
weeks, okay.
yeah. And so in the first half of the second trimester, so like 13 to 20 weeks-ish, it has to be a different procedure because the child is more developed, and you won't be able to just scrape out an embryo. It's larger, it's more developed. And so they'll still do dilation, and then they'll use other tools like forceps and things to basically pull the pieces of the child out. But it's the same general concept. You dilate, you remove, which of course will kill the child. And then what people, and I think most people are kind of aware, they're certainly aware of abortion pills, they're kind of aware of earlier surgical techniques. But it's important to understand that there are abortions in the second half of the second trimester and beyond. And I have found recently, and this is including after viability. We talked about viability, where the child would have a good chance of survival. Even at 22 weeks, if you intervene, it could be up to almost 1 out of 4 children could survive. There are abortions that go past 24 weeks, and there are even abortions that go into the third trimester, and they are not all for medical emergencies. Right. And those procedures, when I try to talk about this, I talk through Secular Pro-Life, we talk a lot about how later abortions are not all medical emergencies. In fact, what data we can find suggests that more of them do involve fetal anomaly, but most of them are still on healthy fetuses carried by healthy women with no medical emergency. I talk about this a lot. People do not want to believe this is true. It is true. You can go to secularprolife.org/later abortions to see this stuff. But anyway, when I talk about this more and more lately, I've had people say, you know, an abortion after viability is just giving birth. And they will even say that you're giving birth to a live child who is then transferred to a NICU. And I think this is coming from 2 factors. First of all, people just straight do not want to believe that anyone would abort a viable, healthy child. And I appreciate that. I don't want to believe it either. It's true, though. The second factor is that the other side talks about how abortion is just the termination of pregnancy, and that's it. They say that whether or not the embryo or fetus or whatever dies isn't the point. The point is that the woman wants to end her pregnancy. Now, if you take that to be literally true, that would mean that all preterm labor with live children is an abortion. It would mean all emergency C-sections are abortions. It would mean full-term birth is an abortion, because those are all terminating the pregnancy. And I think some people do take that to be literally true. And so they think that if you have an abortion procedure after viability, it's just live birth. So I want to be super, super clear when I say, no, it's not. If the child is viable, especially if there are no fetal anomalies, it is common practice, and I would say if there's no fetal anomalies, it's probably ubiquitous, that they will induce fetal demise first. That means they will kill the fetus first before inducing labor or any other procedure. Usually it involves injecting a feticide into the heart or the amniotic fluid. In some cases, they will transect the umbilical cord. So basically the fetus bleeds out and can't get oxygen, all those things. But I just want to be very explicit that when I talk about post-viability abortion procedures, I am not talking about a live birth. It is designed to result in a stillborn child, not a live birth. And this is very important for people to understand for a bunch of different reasons. First of all, most people are outraged by it, but they don't know that it happens. But also, it's important to understand because people talk about abortion in the terms of bodily rights. You know, it doesn't matter if the fetus is a person or not because no one can use my body against my will. But if it was really only about bodily rights and vindicating your right to not have a fetus using your body, if that was all it was about, you would not need to induce fetal demise of a healthy, viable child. You could just birth them. They're not using your body anymore, and they could live. Abortion is not just about vindicating your bodily rights. Abortion is about making sure that you don't have a live child at the end of the process that anyone would be responsible for or have to interact with. That is what it's about. And you can see this in post-viability abortions when they induce fetal demise first. Even C-section, there's something, it's really rare, it's hardly ever used, called hysterotomy abortion. And it's basically, hysterotomy is the surgical cuts that you use in a C-section. And so people will say, that's just a C-section. No, it's not, because if in the rare cases they find they need to do this, they induce fetal demise first, and then they do the hysterotomy. So now, granted, later in pregnancy, past 20 weeks, it's compared to first trimester abortions, comparatively rare. It's something like between 1% and 2% of all abortions are after 20 weeks. Now, that still means thousands a year because of how many abortions there are. But I don't want to mislead people and make them think this is the most common method. And we don't talk about it because we think it's the most common method. We talk about it because people don't believe it's happening, and because the way it's conducted gives away some of the philosophy and the motivation and the undercurrent of why abortions happen.
Exactly. I know in New York State, we have over 1,600 later term abortions every year on average annually. A later term, 20 plus weeks gestation. And I mean, studies show that most later term abortions occur on healthy unborn children and healthy women, right? Those are the majority of these later term abortions. And
there's not really any quantitative studies, but what data we can find does indicate that, yes, like
right.
public health statistics and stuff.
David Reardon, has a published study a while back that made reference. So right to
yeah.
the majority, right? But I don't understand the difference between that live dismemberment when you break up the unborn child in utero, right? Versus injecting the heart with a poison to kill or stop the heart. Why wouldn't you? I don't understand what's the difference between the two procedures? I mean, I know technically, but why use one and not the other? I don't understand, like why.
So your question is, why would they do dismemberment versus injection? Is that your question?
Yeah.
I can't answer with great certainty. My understanding is that with really later procedures, it's basically just induction of labor. A lot of times it's just that they induce fetal demise first, and sometimes they will use forceps or other tools to move the labor along, and that can result in dismemberment. But my impression is that in later procedures, dismemberment is not usually the mechanism of death. It's usually after they've already induced fetal demise. That's my understanding.
And so I'm going to just bring up a topic that I hope to cover as well at a second webinar, and that is what are the negative impacts, of abortion on women? Because it just, to think of a woman undergoing a later term abortion and to understand what possible psychological and physical impacts, these even an early first trimester abortion can have on women. That's something I would love to be able to speak of, because I think that's one issue we all need to understand.
Unfortunately, it's also very controversial. And anytime you have a research subject that's heavily politicized, half of the effort, if not more, is just trying to tease out who's biased and who's not, and is this methodology correct? And so it's an important topic. It's a very important topic, but it's also pretty complicated in terms of what the different sides are saying the research says.
So I'm going to switch gears over to medication abortion, or the abortion pills. There are claims, Monica, and I know you're aware of them, that these abortion pills are safer than Tylenol. What does science say about that?
No, they're not. I'm not even, I want to be very clear here. I'm not even saying here, are abortion pills safe or not safe? Like, this is a comparative thing. Right. But to say they're safer than Tylenol it's on the level of the embryonic hearts of how absurd of a thing that is to say. Like, there are many things the other side says that I don't agree with, but I see why they're saying them. And there are things that I really don't agree with, but if you have different ethical principles, I could see why you would think that. But there are some things that are just, that I'm aghast. And the embryonic hearts is one, and this one is one, because they're not. So the best I can tell, this claim is coming from the idea that more people go to the ER every year for Tylenol than they do for abortion pills. And that's true. Like, thousands more people go to the ER every year for Tylenol than for abortion pills. So I guess people are saying, oh, well, then Tylenol must be more dangerous than abortion pills. But that's not how you would calculate that comparison, because you have to consider how many people take Tylenol versus abortion pills. So there's data I can send you where it found that something like 56,000 Americans a year go to the ER for Tylenol, for acetaminophen toxicity. Tylenol, it's like overdosing on Tylenol, maybe not intentionally, but 56,000 a year. And back of the envelope calculation, this is a really rough calculation based on Guttmacher statistics. If you have 930,000 abortions in 2020 and 54% were with pills, and then there was the study that found that 6% of those went to ER urgent care. If you calculate all that out, it comes to, I think, 33,000 people went to ER urgent care for abortion pills. So like, okay, 56,000 for Tylenol, 33,000 for abortion pills. I guess Tylenol is more dangerous. But the thing is, 60 million people take Tylenol a week. And so if you calculate that out, that's 3.1 billion with a B doses a year. And so if 56,000 of them go to the ER, that's an ER rate per dose of 0.002%. Whereas the study found that 6% of people who took abortion pills went to the ER urgent care. Basically, if these numbers are correct, you're 3,000 times more likely to go to the ER when you take an abortion pill than when you take Tylenol. And so then some people say, well, just because you go to the ER, it doesn't mean anything was wrong. You might be scared, you know, that it's happened many, many times. People are scared. They go to the ER, they check them out. They're like, you're okay. It's okay. So just because you go to the ER, it doesn't mean anything was wrong. And maybe abortion stigma is making people afraid and they're going to the ER when they didn't need to. And even if that were the case, to argue that it was 3,000 times worse, I think is a stretch, but that's okay. We could just look at hospitalizations where you went to the ER and they're like, something is wrong and we need to admit you to the hospital. So for Tylenol, for acetaminophen toxicity, it was 2,600 hospitalizations a year. For the abortion pill, it was 0.9%. I forget what the number came out to. So 2,600 hospitalizations for Tylenol out of 3.1 billion doses, that comes to a hospitalization rate, follow me here, of 0.00008%. Okay, a very low rate. And for the abortion pill, the hospitalization rate was 0.7%. So also a low rate. You take the abortion pill, the odds of you going to the hospital is 0.7%. I wouldn't say that you should panic. I'm not saying that, but that's still over 8,000, almost 9,000 times more likely to be hospitalized for the abortion pill than for Tylenol. So you can argue the abortion pill is safe and effective or not if you want, but I don't know why they're saying it's safer than Tylenol, except for just to give people false comfort. It's in no way, in no metric, safer than Tylenol. And by the way, everything I just told you, that was for when people take Tylenol incorrectly, when they take too much Tylenol that they're not supposed to, compared to people taking the abortion pill correctly. So if you really wanted to compare it, it would be people taking Tylenol the way they're supposed to, and it would be even lower than that. So no, abortion pills are not safer than Tylenol. I don't know why they say that.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you, Monica. I mean, there's so much to talk about in regards to just chemical abortion and the whole idea behind telemedicine. And so no longer do you need to pick up pills in person
or have an exam, have an ultrasound exam.
Exactly. So much there, but I've learned so much, and I hope our audience has as well. Emily's going to go ahead and open it up to the audience Q&A here and ask you some of these questions from the audience.
Yes, sure. We have a couple minutes before we wrap up for a couple questions. The first being on your stance of the use of abortion for miscarriage management. And could you explain the scientific difference between abortion and miscarriage?
That is a really good question. So miscarriage management covers a couple different things. You can have, if you have a missed miscarriage, which is when your child has died, but your body has not passed the remains are still in your body. And it seems like you're not going to pass the remains naturally, which happens frequently, then the procedures and medications to help that along are identical to first trimester abortion procedures and medications. And so people will say, you know, well, so you've had an abortion, right? Or they'll say, well, you can't legislate it because you're going to be legislating both induced abortion and miscarriage management. I will say very, very clearly, no, I do not have a problem with miscarriage management. There is an enormous ethical difference between removing the remains of an already dead human being versus a procedure or medications that will kill a human being. And it's it's night and day. It's not a fine line at all. And it's also not difficult to legislate. If you look at the legal language of a lot of pro-life laws, and I know Texas for sure as a good example, they'll say, legally, we are defining abortion to be this, this, and this, and not these things. And one of the things they say is it's not an abortion if it's done to remove the remains of a dead unborn child. So miscarriage management, medically, the procedures and the medications, they are the same procedures and medications. They are the same. Ethically, they're nothing alike because of whether or not they're causing a death. Now, there is a separate topic, which is threatened miscarriage. Missed miscarriage, the child has died, your body has not passed the remains. Threatened miscarriage, there are reasons to think you're probably going to lose the child, but the child is not dead and the child still has a heartbeat. And this is where a lot of the stories you're hearing of women struggling to get the care that they should get, it's not missed miscarriage, it's threatened miscarriage. And basically you have situations where doctors are saying that, yes, this is very dangerous and maybe you could hemorrhage or something, but since the child still has a heartbeat, I'm not allowed to do anything. The controversy is not about whether or not that is happening. That has happened. It should not be happening. The controversy is about why it's happening. So the other side is saying, well, it's happening because of these laws. They're too confusing and doctors are afraid to act and the laws are harming women. And then you have legislators and doctors on the pro-life side are saying that doesn't make any sense because the laws say if it's a medical emergency, it's definitely legal. They also say to use reasonable medical judgment. If all doctors, pro-life and pro-choice, think that it's reasonable medical judgment to treat her in this case because she's in danger, then it's well within the law. And so the debate is about whether that's how they're interpreting the law and why or why not. So I'm not against miscarriage management, either for missed miscarriage or for threatened miscarriage where she's in danger. No, I don't think anybody should be against that because the first one is removing the remains of a dead child and the second one is triage. And I don't think those have much to do with the 95% plus of abortions that are aborting healthy fetuses carried by healthy mothers with no medical emergency.
Right.
Was there a second part that I missed or was that the whole question?
No, that was that second part that you said answered everything. Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
We have time for one more. We would like to know your stance on use of abortion for fetal anomalies.
So yeah, that's a difficult one for sure, because when people talk about abortion for fetal anomalies, they're picturing things like anencephaly, like the child is not growing a skull or something that they will not survive. But laws are often written with exceptions that will allow exceptions for any anomaly, which can include things like Down syndrome or spina bifida. And so the first thing I want to say is please be careful what you are talking about, because in one case, you're basically talking about using abortion as euthanasia. And I think, parents are in this horrible situation and they want to prevent their own suffering and their child's suffering, and they believe this is the best course of action. Whether you agree with them or not, that's almost always the motivation. Whereas abortion for Down syndrome, that is a different thing. I would say that's just straight ableism. It's a different thing. But for fatal anomalies, I think that people aren't aware of and aren't notified enough of what perinatal hospice is and whether they have access to that. I think that should be standard regardless of what the abortion laws are in any given state. Palliative care, that kind of thing. People are aware of, when you think of hospice, you think of elderly people, but there's such a thing as perinatal hospice for these situations. And there are plenty of parents who have used it and felt like that was the better choice for them. But getting to the core of the question, which is, do you think it should be legal or not? I will say that I'm much more sympathetic to it. I'm not sure that I think it's the right course of action, but I do think it's kind of a different category entirely from just general elective abortion, because abortion for euthanasia for children who are going to die shortly thereafter anyway, I just think it's a totally different motivation. It's a totally different mentality. And it's basically the euthanasia debate as applied to abortion. And I feel sympathetic to the euthanasia debate too. I lean personally, this is not an official secular pro-life stance or anything, I lean against it. I worry about the slippery slope. I worry about all these things, but I get why people fall on either side of it. And I see that in abortion for fetal anomalies as well. And I definitely don't think that we should alienate people who are against elective abortion broadly, but are much more hesitant about this situation. I still consider them pro-life allies, and I still consider them people we should be partnering with on the bigger issue of elective abortion. But I guess, so basically my answer is, yeah, that's a tough one.
Yeah.
I am sympathetic to it.
Great. Wow.
And I think the whole idea of like fetal anomaly can become, it just is also, it's discretionary, it's confusing. What does that
Yeah.
even mean?
Right.
I feel like
What about false positive diagnosis?
Absolutely.
What about the
whole-
difference between
yeah.
presumptive test versus confirmatory test?
Absolutely.
It's
You hear
again,
so many
multifaceted.
stories, exactly, of women that are like, my doctor told me I should have had an abortion because this was going to happen and that was going to happen, and I decided not to.
And then it didn't happen, or it happened and you still were glad you didn't do it. Like,
it's complicated.
It
But I
is.
mean, what an exciting opportunity to be able to have this conversation, knowing that we don't all agree on all these things. FCLNY is consistent life ethic.
Sure.
We oppose assisted suicide,
Sure.
all these kinds of things. But to have this conversation, because there's so much that we all have in common, and nowhere the world over are we going to all agree on every point, but to become better informed and
to find the common ground where we can get things done.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's so important to all come together and to have discussion. So thank you so much, Monica, for coming and for speaking with us. This was so wonderful and informative. And thank you everybody for attending and for your incredible questions. Glad we got to answer a couple of them. And for Michelle, thank you so much for organizing.
Sorry, we should book a 4-hour one and then 3
I know
hours
we got to do it
just
again. We got to do it again. But there's so much information out there that we have on our website, and you, Monica, on Secular Pro-Life. So if you don't already follow us on social media, please do. Our Twitter is Nonviolent Femme, post every day. Our Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, YouTube is Feminist Choosing Life NY. We will be posting the full video of this on our YouTube, so please make sure you're following us to get the notification. You can watch it again. You can watch it 4 times. And of course, follow Monica, Secular Pro-Life, on their social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube. Monica has amazing TikToks. They are so good. I'm watching them all day. Their handle is Secular Pro-Life. And also, please just go to the websites for more information. We have FCLNY.org, and of course, Monica is secularprolife.org. And we really look forward to connecting in the future with you, Monica, and with all of you who are here and on YouTube. And so thank you for joining us for the science behind the abortion debate.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.